The day Kolade arrived at Alhaji Bellow's compound, the gateman didn't open the gate immediately. He looked him over first, the worn slippers, the single bag held together by a knotted cloth, the eyes that stayed on the ground, like a boy who had already been told his place. Then the gateman opened the gate, not wide, just enough. That was Kolade's welcome to Bellow compound, in the old part of Ibadan, where wealth was quiet but visible in everything. The polished tiles, the 2 cars under the shade, the smell of fresh stew drifting from a kitchen he was not allowed to enter. He was not a guest. He was not family. He was payment. His mother, Mama Kolade, owed Alhaji Bello a debt she could not repay. Money borrowed 2 years earlier to save a business that failed anyway. And when the Alhaji sent word that he was tired of waiting, she sent her son instead. Kolade was 22, old enough to walk, old enough to suffer quietly, old enough, she told herself, to understand. But understanding and accepting are 2 different things. That evening, as Kolade swept the outer compound alone, a young woman crossed the yard without glancing his way. She wore a crisp Ankara blouse, carried herself like someone who had never once been told to be small, and disappeared through the main door without a word. That was Lara, Alhaji Bello's only daughter. And somewhere in Abeokuta, in a modest compound behind the Itaiko market, Mama Kolade told her neighbors she had made a sacrifice for her son's future. She had no idea what kind of future she had just handed him. But before we begin, please like and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Kolade had not always been this quiet. There was a time, before the failed shop, before the debt, before the silence that swallowed their home, when his mother laughed easily, when she called him her bright one, when she pressed his school uniform each morning like it was the most important thing she would do that day. That was before his father died and left nothing behind but a name. Baba Kolade had been a plumber, not wealthy but steady, the kind of man whose work spoke before he did. He repaired pipes for half the compounds in their street, kept a small notebook of every job, every customer, every naira owed and paid. When he died suddenly of a stroke at 51, that notebook was the only thing he left behind. Kolade had kept it, not for the money records, just to feel the handwriting. Mama Kolade had grown up in Abeokuta, in a family where pride was worn like a second skin. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. When her husband died, she refused to let the neighborhood see her sink. She sold what she could, managed what remained, and within 6 months she had a plan. She borrowed from Alhaji Bello, a man her late husband had done casual business with full confidence. She was going to sell fabric, good Ankara, imported lace, the kind of material Abeokuta women saved for weddings and naming ceremonies. She found a stall near a Toku market, had it painted, even printed small flyers. What she didn't have was luck. The business lasted 8 months. A supplier disappeared with her largest restocking payment. A fire in the row of stalls ahead of her drove customers away for weeks. By the time things stabilized, the money was gone and the debt to Alhaji Bello had grown quietly, the way debts do when you stop looking at them directly. For 2 years, he was patient, sending reminders through middlemen, adjusting interest, waiting. When patience ran out, he sent one final message, not a threat, just a fact. Send me something of value, or I take what I am owed through the courts. In Abeokuta, a court case meant public record. Public record meant permanent shame, the kind that followed a family to church, to the market, to every conversation for years. Mama Kolade could not afford that.
She called Kolade into the parlor and told him Alhaji Bello needed a reliable house assistant, that it was temporary, that it would settle everything and spare them both from disgrace. She did not call it what it was. Kolade looked at her for a long time, at the way her hands stayed folded too neatly in her lap, at the way she held his gaze just slightly too steady, the way people do when they have already decided and are only now performing the conversation. Then he stood up and picked up his bag, not because he believed her, but because he had his father's practicality in him. In families shaped by survival, sometimes you move first and grieve later. Inside Bellow compound, power had its own architecture. Alhaji Bello was a man of few words and precise expectations. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had a way of looking at a person that communicated exactly where they stood, and for most people inside that compound, they did not stand high. The senior housekeeper, Madame Risi, was the instrument of that order. Compact, efficient, and sharp in the way of someone who has spent decades making herself indispensable. On Kolade's first morning, she walked him through every rule without pausing for questions. You sweep before 6. You eat after the household has eaten. You don't enter the main parlor unless called. You don't speak to guests. You don't look at Lara. That last one came without explanation or softening. Kolade nodded and said nothing, but he noticed everything.
3 months into his time at Bellow compound, Kolade had learned the full rhythm of the house. When the Alhaji rose, when Madame Risi relaxed her watch, when the compound was briefly, quietly his own. He used that time well. He was thorough in ways that exceeded what anyone asked of him. He fixed a leaking pipe beneath the boys' quarters that Alhaji Bello's regular handyman had listed on 3 consecutive work orders without touching. He reorganized the supply store so that stock could be counted in minutes rather than an hour. When the generator failed mid-evening during a dinner the Alhaji was hosting for 4 business associates, it was Kolade who slipped out, traced the fault to a corroded switch connection, and had it running again before the food got cold. The guests never knew anything had gone wrong. Alhaji Bello said nothing to Kolade directly, but the next morning, the Alhaji's driver mentioned quietly that he had been asked to note the name of whoever fixed the generator. What Kolade didn't know was that Lara had been watching longer than her father. Not with the suspicion Madame Risi carried, with something closer to curiosity. She had grown up watching people in that compound make themselves small to survive it, bowing and retreating and erasing personality to become function. Kolade did not do that. He was quiet, yes, but his quietness was not submission. It was concentration. There was a difference, and she had spent enough time around both to know it clearly. She began leaving books near the store entrance, casually, as though she had set them down and forgotten them. An engineering journal, a worn copy of a business text on supply chain management, once a biography of Aliko Dangote with a corner folded at the chapter titled Starting with Nothing. Kolade read every one. At night, by the thin light that crept under the boys' quarters door. He read slowly, annotating nothing. He had no pen to spare, but retaining everything the way men retain things they have decided matter. Then one afternoon, Alhaji Bello summoned him to the main corridor. "They tell me you repaired the water pump last week." It was not a question. "Yes, sir." "Where did you learn that?" "My father was a plumber, sir. Before he passed, he taught me the basics." A pause settled between them. Alhaji Bello studied him in that particular way of his, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of a man reassessing a figure he had placed in the wrong column. Kolade did not feel the silence. He had learned early that unnecessary words were a kind of weakness. "Come to my office tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. He left without waiting for a response. Madame Risi had seen the exchange from the far end of the corridor. She said nothing immediately, but her eyes stayed on Kolade's back as he walked away, and something in her posture shifted, the slight straightening of a person who has just registered a threat they did not anticipate. That evening, she contacted Mama Kolade in Abeokuta. The message was brief and deliberate. Your son is becoming too comfortable here. You should remind him of his place before someone else has to do it for you. Mama Kolade read it once, then again. She sat with it for an hour. She did not call Kolade to ask what was happening. That would have required acknowledging that something was happening that she owed him an explanation for. She did not write back to Madame Risi asking for more detail. Instead, she called Bellow compound directly and asked to speak with the Alhaji. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. What she said in those 11 minutes would be the second time she handed her son away, and this time she did it without leaving her parlor in Abeokuta, without looking him in the eye, and without the excuse of desperation. This time, it was something colder. It was choice.
Alhaji Bellow called Kolade in the next morning, as promised, but the atmosphere in the office had changed. The door was closed when Kolade arrived. Usually, it stood open. The Alhaji did not look up immediately. He finished reading something on his desk first, set it aside, then folded his hands. Your mother called me yesterday. Kolade said nothing. She expressed concern that you are developing ideas above your situation here. A measured pause. She asked me to reassign you away from the main house operations. Sir, you will work with the grounds crew from tomorrow. Outdoor maintenance only. There was no anger in the Alhaji's voice, no irritation, just the clean delivery of a decision already made. That was what made it so difficult to hold. It wasn't cruelty. It was administration, and administration does not leave room for argument. Kolade walked out of that office and stood in the compound for a long moment. The morning light was still soft, catching the edge of the polished tiles near the entrance. Somewhere in the main house, he heard Lara's voice on a phone call, the easy laughter of someone whose day had not just collapsed around them. He breathed in, then out. His mother. Not Madame Risi, whose wariness at least made strategic sense, the housekeeper protecting her own position in the compound's hierarchy. Not Alhaji Bellow, who only received a call and responded to it rationally. His mother, the woman who pressed his school uniform each morning, who called him her bright one, who placed him in this compound to settle her debt, and then, the very moment he began to distinguish himself, reached from Abeokuta across the distance to press him back into the ground. He reported to the grounds crew the next morning without complaint. The work was physically harder, clearing drainage channels, turning soil, hauling fertilizer under the afternoon sun. The crew were decent men, mostly older, who asked few questions and expected nothing beyond steady work. He gave them that and quiet company, and they respected him for both. But every morning before the compound stirred, he was already awake. He read by phone screen light, battery rationed carefully. He watched how the compound's drainage behaved in the early rains and how much water was lost to the street. He tracked kitchen supply runs and identified waste from poor scheduling, perishables ordered in bulk, partially used, discarded before the next order arrived. He drafted solutions in a worn notebook from Abeokuta, the last one from a park his father had bought him years ago. A water recycling system to cut external supply cost by nearly half. A kitchen schedule built around actual consumption, not habit. He had no channel to present any of it. So one quiet morning, before the driver arrived, he placed the notebook on the bonnet of Alhaji Bellow's car and walked back to the ground without looking behind him. He never followed up. He returned to the soil and kept walking, hands moving even when the outcome was uncertain. Back in Abeokuta, the death was formally cleared that same week. Alhaji Bellow had announced it to their shared community contacts, which carried the weight of a public declaration. Women at the Itaiko market stopped Mama Kolade to congratulate her. A neighbor called her wise. Another said her late husband would have been proud of how she managed. She smiled and accepted every word. She sent Kolade no message, no food parcel wrapped in newspaper, the way mothers send things to sons who are far from home. Not a single word passed through any middleman. He was 22, walking another man's land under the open sky, and as far as his mother was concerned, the matter was settled. Alhaji Bello read the notebook 3 times. The first time, he went through it quickly, expecting rough ideas, half-formed suggestions. What he found instead were calculations, specific, measurable, grounded in the actual layout of his compound. The water recycling system had been drawn, with drainage positions mapped entirely from memory, accurately. The kitchen supply schedule correctly identified the 3 biggest waste points and proposed zero-cost adjustments requiring only a change in ordering sequence. He read it a second time, pen in hand. The third time, he took his own notes. 2 weeks passed and he said nothing. Kolade continued walking the grounds, said nothing, asked nothing. He simply kept implementing, quietly adjusting the drainage channels according to his own sketches, rerouting the runoff by hand, without permission and without announcement. He did not know whether the notebook had been read or thrown away. He walked as though it had been read. Then on a Tuesday morning, Alhaji Bello drove the car to the grounds himself. None of the household staff had ever seen him do that. The Alhaji was not a man who came to you, you went to him. The grounds crew stopped what they were doing when they saw him step out of the vehicle, unsure whether they had done something wrong. The Alhaji did not look at them. He looked at the drainage channel where Kolade was walking, knee-deep in the earth, redirecting water flow with his hands exactly as the notebook had outlined. He stood and watched for several minutes. Kolade sensed him before he turned. He straightened slowly, not startled, and waited. "You implemented it?" the Alhaji said. "You left the notebook on your bonnet, sir. I assumed you had seen it." "I read it." A pause long enough to carry weight. "Who taught you to think this way?" Kolade met his gaze steadily. "No one, sir. I paid attention to what was being wasted." Alhaji Bello nodded once, the slow nod of a man confirming something he had already privately concluded. He looked at the channel for another moment, then turned back toward the house without another word. That afternoon, he made a phone call. Not to family, not to a lawyer, to Adekunle Fashola, an old business partner in Abuja who ran infrastructure supply contracts across 5 northern states and had been asking Bello for months whether he knew any sharp young men worth investing time in. Men with practical intelligence, not just paper qualifications. Men who thought about problems before they were asked to. "I have someone," Alhaji Bello said. "He came to me as a debt. He is leaving something else entirely." Fashola asked a few questions. Alhaji Bello answered them plainly. The call ended with an agreement. That evening, Alhaji Bello called Kolade to his office. When Kolade arrived, Lara was already seated inside, positioned to one side of the room, not pretending to be passing through, not offering any explanation for being there. "Sit," the Alhaji said. Kolade sat. "You did not arrive in this compound as an employee. You came here as a settlement. I want you to know that I understand the difference, and I know which of the two you have actually been since the day you arrived." He slid a business card across the desk. "That is Fashola. His firm holds government infrastructure contracts because he delivers without excuses. He needs a coordinator who thinks on his feet and does not require supervision to produce results. I have told him you are that person." Kolade looked at the card. He did not reach for it immediately. "Why?" he asked. Alhaji Bello held his gaze without looking away. "Because your mother sent me a boy to retire a debt, but you showed me a man I would have paid to keep. Those are not the same thing, and I am old enough to know better than to waste what is real." Kolade picked up the card. Across the room, Lara said nothing, but she was watching him with an openness she had not shown before, and this time she made no attempt to disguise it.
News in Abeokuta does not travel. It spreads, the way water spreads on a flat surface, finding every crack and corner without being directed. It started as a question. "You heard anything about Mama Kolade's son, the one she sent to that compound in Ibadan?" Within a week, it had become a statement.
The boy Alhaji Bellow placed in Abuja, senior coordinator with Fashola Infrastructure. They say the starting salary alone is more than most men in this street earn in a year. Mama Kolade heard the earliest version from a woman at the Itaeko market, delivered with the particular pleasure of someone who had always found Mama Kolade's pride slightly excessive. She dismissed it immediately. People exaggerate, she said. They see a small thing and make it a big story. But the details kept sharpening. A specific firm name, a job title that could be verified. A figure passed quietly between men who knew the Abuja contracting world. By the time it reached her a third time, it had the texture of fact, not rumor. She sat alone in her parlor that evening and felt the full weight of what she had done. Not what she had intended, but what she had actually done. The calls she placed to Kolade that week were unanswered. Not blocked, she would check and the line would ring. He simply chose not to pick up. There is a particular kind of message in an unanswered call from someone who you know has seen your name on the screen. It is quieter than anger, and it reaches further. She traveled to Abuja without telling anyone where she was going. The building in Maitama unsettled her before she even entered it. Glass front, corporate signage, a uniformed security man at the door who directed her to a receptionist who asked her name with a smile that made no assumptions. She gave her name. She was told to wait. She waited 40 minutes. When Kolade appeared, she almost did not recognize him, not because he had changed physically, but because everything that surrounds a man when he knows where he stands had shifted. He wore a plain but well-fitted shirt. He walked with the unhurried pace of someone with no reason to rush and no one to impress. He sat across from her the way a man sits when he is not afraid of the conversation he is about to have. "Mama," Kolade, "I know why you came, Mama." She reached across the table for his hand. He let her take it, but his hand stayed still, neither accepting nor withdrawing, just present. "I didn't understand what I was doing, Mama. I thought I was managing the situation. I thought I was being practical." "You were protecting yourself from shame," he said, not harshly, with the evenness of someone who has sat with a truth for long enough that the edges no longer cut. The debt, the arrangement, calling the Alhaji when Madam Risi warned you, all of it was about what the neighborhood would say. "I understand that. I grew up in the same neighborhood." She started to speak. He continued quietly. "I have forgiven you. I want you to know that clearly. But forgiveness is not the same as returning to what we were. You made a decision about my worth without asking me. I have spent the last 18 months proving that decision wrong. Those are not things that simply reset." Her eyes filled. "Can we not start again?" "We are not enemies, Mama. I will not cut you off or disgrace you. But what we were before, you as the authority and me as the one who accepts whatever you decide, that is gone." He stood. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. She left Abuja on the evening bus. The journey back to Abeokuta took 4 hours. She sat by the window the entire time and watched the road without seeing it. At home, the neighborhood still praised her for handling her debt with cleverness. She no longer corrected, but she no longer smiled either. The distance she had cut between herself and her son with one 11-minute call now lived in the space between 2 chairs she would never again close. Kolade spent 3 years in Abuja. His first 6 months under Fashola were the hardest, not because the work was beyond him, but because everyone around him had credentials he lacked and connections he hadn't built. What he had instead was something harder to teach: the discipline of a man who had learned to work without an audience. He was the first in the office most mornings. He made mistakes, 2 significant ones in the first year, and each time he reported them to Fashola before anyone else discovered them, arriving with the diagnosis and a solution already written out. Fashola, who had spent decades watching men deflect and blame, found this unusual enough to mention to Alhaji Bello. "The boy you sent me owns his errors. That is rarer than you think." "I know," Alhaji Bello replied. "That is why I sent him." By his second year, Kolade was leading site assessments independently. By the third, he had registered a small consultancy, 2 staff, a rented office in Wuse, 1 contract sourced entirely through his own network. He was not wealthy yet, but what he was building belonged fully to him, assembled from nothing but attention and refusal. It was during this third year that Lara visited Abuja on genuine business. Her father's firm was expanding a supply relationship with a company there. Kolade's office was 3 streets from her meeting. She messaged to ask if he was free for lunch. He was. They met at a quiet place near the ministry district. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Bellow compound, not about the past, about the work each of them was doing and why. About what Lara wanted that Comfort had never quite given her. They had lunch the following week and the week after. What grew between them was not dramatic. It was deliberate, 2 people choosing each other in increments, without performance. When Alhaji Bello understood what was happening, he sat with it for a full evening before saying anything. Then he called his daughter. "The young man, he is serious?" "Yes," Lara said. A silence. Then, "Good. I told him he was worth more than the debt that brought him to me. It appears he listened." Back in Abeokuta, the story of Mama Kolade and her son became the kind of neighborhood legend told in pieces, depending on who was telling it. Those who liked her emphasized the hard circumstances of a widow managing debt alone. Those who didn't emphasized the phone call, the reassignment, the 40-minute wait in a Maitama reception. Most people held both versions at once, because life rarely delivers the clean verdict we prefer. But on one point, no one disagreed. The young man who arrived at Bellow compound with a knotted bag and downcast eyes, the one the gateman opened the gate for only halfway, had become the kind of man for whom doors opened before he reached them. Not because fortune was kind, not because the right people appeared at the right moment, but because he had decided, in the quietest part of himself, that no arrangement, not his mother's fear, not another man's compound, not the weight of a debt he had not incurred, would be the final word on who he was. He had been handed away like a liability. He left like an asset no one had been wise enough to hold.
There will always be people who decide your worth before you have finished becoming. The danger is not that they judge you. The danger is that you begin to judge yourself by their verdict. Guard what you know about yourself. Build in silence. The right people will recognize what you have built. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button, like, share, and drop a comment below. We have more stories on the way that we believe will stay with you long after the screen goes dark.